It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative Party Deputy Chairman Lee Rowley, Labour leader in the Lords Angela Smith, Financial Times Whitehall editor Sebastian Payne and Press Association political correspondent Jerry Scott. Today, the reshuffle of Boris Johnson's ministers is still underway.
There are people that are right for certain times and there are people right for other times.
Big changes at the top. Will they make a big difference to the future of the country?
If you need any assistance at all, just let me know, OK?
Was that the right response to protests on the motorway?
The Conservative Party candidate, 17,000.
We know Labour lost seats in the so-called Red Wall. My guest, Seb Payne, has been visiting some of them. We'll talk about who could win them next time. And care workers have until today to get a jab. What happens if they don't?
Well, I'm happy to have had it done, but those people who choose not to are going to lose their jobs.
Well, let's pick up on that last story. She's right, the woman you saw there. Let's show you the headline in the Daily Mail. Fears of care staff exodus over no jab, no job policy. Nursing homes are facing shortage of workers if officials don't scrap deadline for COVID vaccinations, warn the union. So today is the deadline. Should unvaccinated care workers be sacked?
Well, we hope that won't be necessary. People have had the last couple of months to make decisions and there have been lots of discussions which have occurred, I know, because I've been in some of my own care homes in North East Derbyshire. We hope that most people will take the opportunity to get the jab because it's really important that we're doing it for a reason.
And if they don't?
We hope that they were able to find employment elsewhere in the care home or the care home group. Often these care homes have a substantial number of different locations, so there may be other functions that they can go into. But ultimately, this is a very difficult decision. Nobody wants to constrain the kind of freedom and liberty and choices that's being talked about, but we're doing it because of the challenges that we've had previously.
Angela, should they be sacked?
Well, actually they won't, because the government's given a sort of 3-month grace period where you can self-certify to say, I've got a reason I can't have it. But I think there's a difference between saying to somebody, we really, really want you to have this vaccination, it's very important, and to people who've been on the front line throughout the pandemic, you'll be sacked if you don't. I'd look at Wales and what's happening in Wales. Wales has significantly higher numbers of people in care homes vaccinated. It's 95%. They haven't felt the need to say you'll be sacked if you don't because of the way they've handled it and encouraged people to do so. So for me, that is a much, much better approach. And I wonder what will happen if people have to leave their jobs. And it's very well saying you can move to a different kind of job, but there's 170 vacancies at present. What happens if a significant proportion, I think it's between 10 and 20%, haven't had the vaccination, so lower, significantly lower than in Wales? If they leave, what happens in their care homes?
Well, it is more complicated, though, isn't it, Seb and Jerry, alluded to there by Angela. But the other side, the flip side of the coin is, can you allow unvaccinated care workers into homes where there are elderly and vulnerable residents as we approach winter? Seb?
Well, I think on the medical advice, they should absolutely have coronavirus vaccines, as should anyone, really. But I think it really comes down to a moral question is this something we're willing to do as a society? Now, we are likely to have vaccine passports are going to come in at some point over the autumn and winter because it's clear that, the situation with the pandemic is getting worse. I think it's a pretty open and shut case here that it should be completely obligatory because the idea that you're going to allow people into care homes, and we know how disastrous the pandemic was in care homes during 2020 and 2021, that there should be no real question about it at all. And as I think Angela was saying, the government have given people a long period of time here to get those jabs. So if they're not willing to do it, then I don't think they should really have those jobs. So in this particular instance, I think compulsion is the right answer.
Jerry, do you agree with that, even with the desperate shortage of care home workers?
I do agree, and I don't really see why this is so controversial. I think it's really interesting, the difference between the COVID vaccination and other types of things that you have to have a certain job. For example, DBS checks to be a teacher, or other vaccinations to be a nurse or a doctor, or even vaccinations to go on holiday, the kind of travel jabs you would usually get. And it's interesting to me what the particular fear is over this coronavirus jab. But I completely agree with what Seb said. I think because we saw such devastation in care homes in the early days of the pandemic, it's just absolutely unthinkable that might happen again and that coronavirus might be taken back into these care homes.
All right, well, we'll follow this story because there is a period of grace if people have exemptions on medical grounds. Let's move on to the reshuffle, the big story of yesterday, continuing on to today. And we'll see some of those perhaps more junior ministerial positions being announced. But we've certainly seen some big major changes in the top team. Let's start with the promotions, the winners, if you like. There's Liz Truss on the left, promoted from International Trade to Foreign Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi from Vaccines Minister to Education Secretary, and perhaps the biggest surprise, a leap from being Minister in the Department of Health to Culture Secretary for Nadine Dorries. These were the big sackings, starting on the left with the now former Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, not a surprise to most people. Robert Jenrick, Housing Secretary, he's gone, and perhaps more surprisingly, Robert Buckland has departed as Justice Secretary. Then there were what we've called the Cabinet movers. You've got Dominic Raab there, demoted from Foreign Secretary to become Justice Secretary, but picks up a few more titles on the way, stays as Deputy Prime Minister and also Lord Chancellor. We've got Michael Gove, who has moved as Cabinet Office Minister to Housing and Community Secretary. He will keep his job's responsibility for strengthening the union and for that phrase, levelling up. And Oliver Dowden is now the Conservative Party co-chair. He was in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Let's see how the front pages have covered it. There is a common theme. Daily Express, Prime Minister's ruthless cull to deliver Britain's future. And on the front page of The Guardian, PM's ruthless reshuffle lays ground for next election, whenever that is going to be, 2023 or 24, with Dominic Raab and Liz Truss there. She taking, obviously, his old job. So just how ruthless exactly was this reshuffle, Jerry, in your mind?
I think it was a bit more ruthless than was expected, to be honest. And it really, I think, shows that Boris Johnson wants to show that he has strength. And I do think it's the right analysis to say that this is gearing up for campaigning. I mean, we've already got reports of Oliver Dowden saying, get ready for an election. You've got people like Michael Gove having wide-ranging briefs over levelling up and the union and really delivering those things that the Tories think that Conservative voters will want to see, whether that's 2023 or 2024, when they next go to the polls. And, I do think that this is a reset after the pandemic as well. I think what is really interesting also is shoring up education and health, which obviously have taken a massive battering, not one of the kind of great offices of state, but become more important in the last couple of years and really come to the forefront. So ruthless, yes, but I think also quite sensible. These are people in these jobs who are loyal, but who will also probably do them quite well and have expertise in the area. So wide-ranging, but probably quite sensible as well.
Loyal, in terms of the way we've just heard there from Jerry, some of those, of course, have gone. So do you see it as ruthless then, Seb?
I think it was, actually. And I think the only thing I would say is I'm not quite sure this was a pre-election reshuffle. Everything that I see in here is that the government is still very keen to think about 2024 because they want to get past the boundary changes. They want to have as much time as possible to level up the country and get as far away as possible from the coronavirus pandemic. But I think really when you look at it, people like Nadine Dorries, a long-time political ally of Boris Johnson. If you look at Liz Truss as well, I think that move was very interesting with regards to Rishi Sunak, because it's never a good idea in politics to have an obvious heir apparent. And when Boris Johnson's been through his travails over the summer, people have always said, Rishi's there, he's going to challenge him. Now he's brought the most popular cabinet minister among the Tory grassroots to his top table. And that A, counterbalances as Mr. Sunak as a potential future leader. But it also shows the strength of Mr. Johnson's power, that he's willing and able to do this. The same is true with Nadeem Zahawi as well, who won his spurs as vaccine minister and is seen as a very confident media performer. And for me, the theme of the whole thing is focusing on the domestic agenda. You've got Michael Gove, who's gone to communities, housing and local government to really try and get a grip of levelling up. Same with Nadeem Zahawi, the same with Nadine Dorries at culture.
Right, Lee, the big cabinet figures who were moved on might wonder what price loyalty is commanding these days. You're also very loyal in your position as party vice chair. I mean, these people regularly went out to bat for the government, often on very tricky wickets, difficult days, and this is how they're rewarded. They were sacked.
Well, government is a difficult endeavour, and we know that it's been extraordinarily difficult over the last 18 months. I'm sorry for those colleagues who are no longer in government. They've done very good jobs in
all of them?
Very difficult circumstances, and I'm sure that some of them may in time be able to serve again, and there's clear examples of that previously as well. But fundamentally, what happened yesterday and what is happening today is a refresh of a team, recognising we're moving into a new phase, recognising hopefully whilst the pandemic isn't over, we're moving into a different phase of it and we're looking forward. We've got a huge agenda which we promised in 2019, and, you know, quite rightly we focused on the pandemic for a period, but now we need a new team in place to move us forward.
I mean, it isn't always easy to move people on, is it, Angela? I mean, you are, to some extent, a veteran of reshuffles, or certainly being involved in them. And Boris Johnson did discover that with Dominic Raab, who seemingly dug in, which is why he was sort of moved and gained a few more titles. And, of course, Keir Starmer discovered that with Angela Rayner.
I think it was slightly different, and we're not in government, but I think one of the reasons probably Robert Buckland has gone is because Dominic Raab went into Downing Street as an incompetent Foreign Secretary and has come out as Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister. Extraordinary. And so I feel quite sorry for Robert Buckland in that sense, because he was very loyal to the Prime Minister. He was the one, of course, who oversaw the unlawful prorogation of Parliament, and he still got the sack.
Lee?
I don't see this...
Let Lee respond to that.
You would expect me to disagree with your basic contention. The reality is that, you know, Angela, from your time doing this, that people move around, and it is not necessarily a bad thing to refresh a team. That means bringing new people in, and it means, unfortunately, some people having to leave. I have a huge amount of respect for those who've left, but ultimately we have to move on.
But I actually don't see this in the same way as this sort of ruthless reshuffle. I may be an outlier here, but 15 members of the cabinet stay in the same jobs they've had. I think 4 have gone out, 3 have come in. It doesn't feel quite like that for me. And I was watching Liz Truss last night, and I just wonder how much of a grip. We have to judge people on actions, but it's the first cabinet reshuffle I've known that has a strapline, Building Back Better or whatever it is. They're clearly all told to have used certain phrases. So Liz Truss went out there, and the 3 things she said, what was it? Global Britain, levelling up, whatever the other one is, and just sort of gave those. And when he said, what are your priorities for your job? Oh, thank you very much, I'm looking forward to it. I would have liked to have heard something about bringing back those who are still stuck in Afghanistan, talking to international leaders about the climate emergency. So I think this is Boris Johnson getting his friends around the cabinet table. It doesn't really feel to me like it's ruthless at all.
Lee?
I mean, we are seeing a team being put in place for the new phase post-coronavirus with a huge agenda domestically, and also a recognition of global Britain.
How does Dominic Raab stay in post after what's happened?
But interestingly, you said it's not exactly the same, but how did Angela Rayner stay in post when Keir Starmer tried to move her after the failure at the local elections?
It wasn't like that at all. I mean, another time to have the discussion about Angela Rayner.
But it's true, isn't it? He wasn't able to be as ruthless as he wanted to be.
He didn't want to be ruthless with Angela at all. Angela deserves, I think, a much more front-facing role, which she has now, and I think she likes that, and we like it.
She should be promoted on the shadow bench.
Well, she can't really be promoted. She's deputy leader of our party.
She could have another job. She could have another job like Dominic Raab.
Angela's profile is really high, which is what the Labour Party wanted, and we made a mess of that. But we're not in government. And what I'm saying, this is not a ruthless Boris Johnson laying down the law. It's just more of the same.
For the public and for the voters, Lee, what material difference will these new appointments make in terms of policy?
Well, it's important that we're moving on to focus on a broader set of policies than the key focus, which was coronavirus, as we have hopefully getting out of the pandemic. And this new team is able to take those priorities, look again at the departments if they're moving into new ones, and work out what we need to do over the next 12 to 24 months to take the country forward. And if you go back to Angela's point, the reality is, on the point you were making, we have now both a Foreign Secretary who has proven her experience and her ability on the global stage through her previous role in the Department for Trade. And we also have a Justice Secretary who is a lawyer and is somebody who has great experience in that and was also in the department previously.
He's been the most incompetent Foreign Secretary we've had in a generation.
All right, let's move on to Michael Gove. Seb, you mentioned him as a particularly interesting move and appointment. It does come with a significant in-tray, his departmental role, and he's keeping responsibility for the union. We're showing pictures of him walking up that famous street to number 10. And taking on responsibility for levelling up. Now, clearly, he is seen then, is he, as the man to deal with the issues that are trouble areas for the government?
Definitely. I think if you look at what Mr. Gove's done over the past decade, he's always been a troubleshooting minister. You know, when he came as Education Secretary in 2010, it was about reforming that sector with academies and free schools. He did a similar thing in justice, similar thing in education, and he's been doing that at the Cabinet Office with reforming the civil service as well as the coronavirus pandemic. Ministry, Community Housing and Local Government is such a mouthful as a department, and as you said, Jo, it's got the union on as well. The fact is, he's got to deal with planning reform, which is one of the most contentious things Boris Johnson's going to have to do in this parliament. He's got to try and keep the United Kingdom together, which again, if that ends, then so does Boris Johnson's premiership. He's got to get more houses built, again, a very unpopular thing with Conservative MPs. And on top of all that, he's got to somehow deliver this levelling up agenda that not many people in the country or in Whitehall are too sure what it is. So
right.
It's a big in-tray, but I think he's probably the best placed person to do it.
Right. Jerry, what about Gavin Williamson's sacking and being replaced by Nadeem Zahawi? He's tasked now with that education brief. What's he going to be judged on? What will success look like?
I think success will look like how well we can recover our education system for those children and students who missed out so much over the last couple of years. You know, they've been described as the lost generation, which I think is a bit of an unfair characterisation, actually, because they've worked really hard. But what opportunities can be provided for them, what catch-up can be provided for them? I also think keeping an eye on what Gavin Williamson does is going to be key. I mean, some people have suggested you wouldn't want him on the backbenches because he maybe knows where the body's buried.
Because he's a former chief whip.
Been chief whip, exactly. But I do think that maybe the shine has come off of that a bit. Maybe he doesn't know as many secrets as he once did. But yes, I think education will be key. And like I say, whilst not one of the great officers of state, is going to be really important as we recover from the pandemic.
Right, and there's a new culture secretary in Nadine Dorries. The shape of her team hasn't yet been completely finalised because it was a big move. But let me just show you a tweet. We can't show it to you at the moment, but there's a tweet from John Whittingdale saying that he is no longer in his ministerial position in that department. I've got it here. I'm sorry to be stepping down as Minister for Media and Data and saying goodbye to a great team of ministers and officials. It's been a privilege to play a part in shaping the future of UK public service broadcasting and in reforming our data laws using our new Brexit freedom. What are you hearing about this move, Seb?
This is another unexpected move in the reshuffle because John Whittingdale has been front and centre of the government's efforts to privatise Channel 4 and reform the BBC. And Whittingdale is a long-serving Conservative. He worked for Margaret Thatcher as her political secretary and was briefly culture secretary under David Cameron. And when he was brought back by Boris Johnson, those were the two key things he was focusing on. John Whittingdale's approach to the BBC is an interesting one because he's very pro the corporation. He's pro public sector broadcasting, but he's also very pro reforming it at the same time. So it's the kind of idea we need to reform the BBC to save it kind of thing. But with Channel 4, I think he's been one of the most aggressive people within Whitehall saying we need to privatise it as quickly as possible. So the real question is, whoever replaces him, do they feel the same way? Because we know Nadine Dorries, the new culture secretary who heads up that department, has been very critical of the BBC. So it's all eyes on that. I think one person to watch that could be interesting is Andrew Griffith, who is a close ally of Boris Johnson and the former chief executive of Sky. So if he went into that role, he would probably have quite a similar approach. And I noticed this morning he did a very nice tweet praising John Whittingdale, but we still don't know for sure who's going to go in there. All
right, let's just show everybody this headline in the Daily Telegraph, exclusive. Get ready for a general election, says Oliver Dowden. New Conservative chairman tells party staff that the fight for votes starts now with a poll as little as 20 months away. Have you been told to get prepared, Lee?
Well, I'm glad.
Ready?
I don't want a general election just yet. I'm glad that Oliver is getting stuck in on the first day. You know, the important point of a Conservative central office, just like Labour headquarters, is that they're ready for all elections, whether they be local, general, or anything else. And the new chairman is showing that he is keen to focus on what's important. All
right, let's talk about this particular climate change group and protests that have been going on for a number of days. We talked about it earlier in the week. Insulate Britain. They are a group of protesters who stopped the traffic on the M25 motorway for the second time in 3 days yesterday. Now, it caused long delays at junctions in Kent, Surrey and Hertfordshire. 71 arrests were made and police said that the road was clear of protesters by about midday. Let's just listen to this, which is the police talking to the protesters while they sat down on the road. Here it is.
Come and speak to you. If you've got any questions at all, just ask. And if any of you are in any discomfort or need anything, just let me know. And we'll try and sort you out in a nice way. Can't phrase that any worse, could I? But no, if you need any assistance at all, just let me know. OK?
We are joined now by Norman Brennan, a former British Transport Police officer. Norman, what did you make of the way the police talked to the protesters?
Well, to be quite honest with you, I'm ashamed at what policing has become. Policing have lost the streets through the massive government cuts, knife crime, gun crime and violent crime. And it looks like now that they've lost the motorways as well. What I saw yesterday was embarrassing. And what it does, it disenfranchises the public. And when the British public lose their heart and soul and support for British policing, it's a very sad day. When these motorists are held up, many must ask the question, surely there is a law and a reason why the police should remove these or arrest these illegal demonstrators.
Right, now there were 71 arrests, of course. Weren't the police just following procedure? They did clear them eventually?
Well, they clearly didn't have enough officers to clear quite a small number of people at some of these locations. It took hours. And what happens then is that you have tens of thousands of motorists that are absolutely fuming. Some have got hospital appointments. They've just gone back to work after COVID, so they want to keep their jobs. They've got delivery times to keep to. Others are travelling to the airports. And when they see these demonstrators being appeased by police, many of them are thinking, well, if the police can't do the job, surely we can. And under the Highways Act, where it's unlawful obstruction and motorway regulations, there's also an offence of possible breach of the peace.
Except you will know... Yeah, well, you will know, though, Norman, that the police have also been criticised quite heavily, particularly the Metropolitan Police, for what many people have seen as heavy-handedness in the way they have dealt when they have policed certain protests. Would you agree?
You're absolutely right. You know, I'm ashamed as well that many members of the public, I mean, I represent the police, the public and victims, and have done for the past 30 years through the campaigns and within policing that I was involved in. And I'm at a loss of where we are because the police are caught between the rock and a hard place. Frontline officers, I can promise you, wanted to get in yesterday and remove them demonstrators so their fellow drivers could carry about their business. The sad reality is we probably have the weakest senior management within policing that I've known in 42 years. And I think that there should be a clear out at the top. And we need, whether it's ex-military or leaders that know about leadership, that can actually lead men, because at the moment, I'm ashamed to say again, we've got donkeys leading lions that want to get on and support and reassure the public. All
right, Norman, stay with us, because I'm going to open this up to the rest of the guests. Angela, what did you make of the way the police dealt with the protesters there in the clip that we showed? Those protests were very disruptive. Did they take the correct action? I think the protests are hugely disruptive, and anyone in that queue of traffic was probably getting sort of exasperated, desperate in many ways. And I think there's always this difficult tension between police and protesters. You know, I grew up during the Thatcher years, so I've done my fair share of protests. I think one of the golden rules for protesters and the police is for the protesters to make your point, to get public attention to your campaign, to bring it to the attention of those who are making the decisions. Well, that's what they were doing. Disturbing the public to an extent that you lose support, I don't think actually works. But should the police have taken tougher action in the way Norman said? And to come on to the police, I think what the police are trying to do is to do it with as least disruption as possible. One of the problems is when they arrest people, more just take their place. So
I think there should be some more. It's very difficult to take this forward.
But should they have just cleared them right at the start?
Well, they did on the other protests, and more people come back in. So you arrest people, others take their place. So I think the police have to move these people on. We can't have this kind of disruption. But the protesters themselves have to understand if they want to win support, they're not going to do it if they alienate vast swathes of the public that actually support the objectives. Who could be against more home insulation?
No, of course, but we're talking about the balance here and the way the police handled it. I mean, you heard you heard what Norman said. Lee, where are you?
Well, I broadly agree with Angela that there's a absolute right to protest, but protesters should be incredibly cautious and careful about what they do and how they do it. And my biggest point on these kind of guys is that they're attention seekers. They want all of this, but they want us talking about this. They want us highlighting it. I'd prefer just to forget about them, and then maybe they do it less. But when they do appear and try and stop motorways or elsewhere, we need to move them on quickly, and we need to make sure that they don't disrupt lives, they don't cause problems, they don't stop people getting to the airports, they don't interfere in the way that I think they were doing yesterday, and they're not helping their cause. So the best thing to do is to not talk about them and make sure that when they do it, they're moved on quickly.
But isn't one of the great tragedies of this, I think the tragedy of modern politics, is that people think they can achieve more by shouting from the outside than making their voices heard inside.
But what about the people in the queues? What about the people actually sitting in the cars waiting? Would they expect, in the way that Norman Brennan set out, for the police to do their job?
I think absolutely, and the police did. This is a question of time and proportionality, and we saw in other protests, particularly in the centre of London, that the police were in there and moving them on before they even got sat down. So it's clear that in some instances the police are doing that. It's for the police to determine individual circumstances, and I will leave that to the operational decisions of the police officers. But in terms of the principle, should these people be moved on quickly so they don't create the kind of disturbances and problems for people's lives? Yes, absolutely.
Right. I mean, Jerry, is Norman right that the police now are stuck between a rock and a hard place?
I think sometimes, but I don't think really that, protests are supposed to be disruptive by their very nature. So I'm sure that these protesters will see it as quite a win. And we've seen that with, the Extinction Rebellion protests as well. I think they do have to be careful in getting the public on side. But you're right, you highlighted some of the instances we've seen at other vigils and things like that. I think the Sarah Everard one in particular during the lockdown was kind of really poignant in the way that the police handled that as well. So I do see that they may be stuck between a rock and a hard place, but I don't really think scenes yesterday of heavy-handedness would have really helped this situation. These protesters weren't violent, they weren't doing anything as far as I can see other than, causing a lot of disruption and blocking the road, but they weren't, violent or, throwing things, anything like that. So I think that approach was probably right. And of course they do have rights as well. In the clip that you played, they're talking about assistance and things like that. There is a certain way that we still have to treat people, even if they are arrested, to uphold those standards.
Well, I'll put some of that back to Norman in just a moment. Before I do, Seb, I mean, when you look at the legislation that is being proposed, I mean, the government is trying to toughen up response to protests and demonstrations. Will this sort of spill over to some extent in the way they expect the police to behave or not?
I think it will, and if you look at the views of the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, on this, she's been pretty tough on what the police should and shouldn't be doing in terms of protesters, and obviously she has to be careful in terms of how far she pushes it. But I think, as Jerry was mentioning with the Extinction Rebellion stuff, I think there's been a very clear view in the Home Office and across the government. The police have been too light-handed here, and of course you've got to be proportionate on all this kind of stuff. But the thing I just wonder with these increasingly disruptive protests is, what are they trying to achieve? Because if you want to get on the 6 o'clock news by blocking up the M25, fine, but how is that actually going to convince people to get their homes better insulated? Like, the most effective protests are the ones that are targeted at politicians who change the laws, who can do things. And it seems we've got into this world where it's, let's just do more wilder and crazy things to get on the news. But I just don't think that fundamentally helps their cause. And I think this legislation might nudge it in the direction, but I think you do have to be careful that you don't go too far and that protesting becomes too difficult.
Right, Norman, what's your response to what you've heard?
My response is quite clear. If you break the law, the police are there to protect society and reassure society. It's right that they tell these protesters that were breaking the law to desist and leave the scene. If they don't, it's only right and proper that they are arrested or physically removed. What my biggest concern is this, and it's not just about yesterday, it's about many other demonstrations as well. If the public and those aggrieved and sick and tired of having their lives and businesses disrupted start taking the law into their own hands, that becomes vigilantism. I don't want to see that, but I can see it coming. Many serving officers I speak to, and many retired officers, and even members of the public say, if the police that we pay to protect and reassure us can't do it, then we'll take the law into our own hands. And it doesn't matter about proportionality. What it matters about is disorder on the streets of Britain and our roads like we've never seen before.
Well, as you say, you don't want to see vigilantism, but thank you, Norman Brennan, for joining us today. We're going to talk, or certainly start talking, by introducing the book by Seb Payne, Broken Heartlands, A Journey Through Labour's Lost England. Now, this was a big road trip that you did, 6,000-mile road trip, Seb, visiting 10 traditional Labour seats in your Mini, 9 of which turned Tory in 2019. It starts in Blythe Valley and ends in Burnley. Now, you had lots of conversations with different sets of voters, and of course they're not all the same in those parts of the country. But in those conversations, it looks as if you recognise that there's been a weakening of old tribal party loyalties and Brexit has been done. Does this now mean that those voters that you spoke to, their votes are up for grabs in the next election?
I think it does. That, first of all, Labour has to realise these people won't automatically just go back. That obviously a lot of the blame of the 2019 election was portioned on Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, which was particularly unpopular in those places in northern and the Midlands of England that voted Tory for the first time. But I think they entrusted Boris Johnson by saying to him, look, we're voting you to get Brexit done, but also because you promised to change our lives. So when it comes to the next election in 2024 or whenever, they will look at their lives and say, OK, have you got Brexit done? And we could have a whole argument about that. But fundamentally, yes, I think we've left the EU. They can see that. But do they see change of their lives? And that, for me, is where the next election is going to be fought on. If Boris Johnson can say, yes, we have levelled up, we've built new infrastructure, we've improved skills, we've done all sorts of things, then I think they may stick in the Tory column. But if Labour can make the case of saying, in fact, they haven't done that, it's all superficial stuff, then they could be won back. But I think the key thing that we've seen since the Brexit vote in 2016, that umbilical cord between the working class part of England, the former industrial towns, that has broken. And since 2016 and 2017 and 2019, those voters have been moving towards the Conservatives. And if Labour wants to win them back, they've got to find a new reason to do that. That's the key finding of my book, because in places like... Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just finished, but I was just going to get Angela to respond to the point, particularly about Labour first, and then I'll go to Lee. Angela?
I haven't read all of Seb's book. I'm reading the reviews of it, and I find it absolutely fascinating because it's about people. And when I read some of the stories that you're telling, Seb, of people in the Midlands and North, I can hear those same conversations with people from my former constituency in Basildon. And the people that feel quite left behind in society are throughout the country. I don't think they're concentrated, but it became more evident because we saw that sea change in seats in 2019. There is a challenge. We talk a lot about the Labour Party in this, but I think Seb's right. You throw the challenge back at the Conservative Party.
Oh, and we will. But let's...
in terms of agreeing with him about his book. And Boris Johnson made it clear, lend me your votes and see what I can do. And there will be a challenge for the Conservative parties, they can hold their votes, and also a challenge for the Labour Party, because I have to say 2019 was the worst election I've ever worked on for the Labour Party. The response on the doorstep was pretty devastating when you went out. But I think we can change that round. But what we've got to do is the very things you're saying, Seb, is give that offer to people that they believe is credible and can make a difference to their lives, and give that hope and optimism. And I think some of those things that, for example, Rachel Reeves is talking about at the moment, in that we should produce more, buy more, sell more in the UK, and how we can manage the economy more and focus on the UK. Problem I think the Labour Party has had recently, we've got lots of policies, we've like 200 policies, we've not got them into a narrative or theme. And the challenge for us is to do that now and show people this can make a difference. We have to put the past behind us. We've done it before. Now, I remember in elections back in 1987 and 1992 thinking, oh, Labour Party, could we ever win again? And we saw that this isn't unlike, in, say, 2019, the sea change that we saw in 1997. So I'm quite optimistic, but I think there's the normal conventional wisdoms of politics have been put aside, and we have to give more of an offer and prove that we mean what we say and can a credibility that we can do those things.
Right. Do you agree, Lee, broadly, that those votes were lent in 2019 to the Conservative Party and they are now up for grabs?
Oh yes, absolutely. And it's important from our perspective that we earn every piece of support, whether it be in places like mine in North East Derbyshire or in Basildon, which we now hold, because that is the way you put a winning coalition together for the long term. I am one of the Red Wall voters that Seb went and spoke to. He came to my constituency. I am somebody who came from a working class background. My dad was a milkman. My two grandparents were both lived in the mine, worked in the mines. You know, on paper, I shouldn't be in the Conservative Party, but I came to the conclusion back 10, 15, 20 years ago that the kind of opportunities that the Conservative Party offered communities like mine were the ones which could make us progress. And I still don't understand the centre-left prospectus for places like North East Derbyshire. That doesn't mean, therefore, that North East Derbyshire will vote Conservative forever, and it shouldn't mean they do that. It should mean that they ask us every single time and make us earn it. But I don't get what the Labour Party offers constituencies like.
All right, well, we were talking about this issue related to it earlier in the week. Our guest was Matthew Goodwin from the University of Kent, and he was explaining where he thought voters in former Labour seats, like the ones you were talking about, seem to be voting now.
So far, it's not the case that Conservative voters are defecting to the Labour Party. There are a very small number who are doing so, but the main direction of travel are Conservatives withdrawing from politics and going into apathy. They're saying they're not going to vote at the next election, or they're not sure who they're going to vote for. And then within that group, I think there's also a fairly significant number who are switching over to the Reform Party,
Really?
which is now up to 10% among 2019 Conservative voters.
Let's have a look at the poll, actually, that did trigger quite a lot of interest, actually mainly the YouGov Westminster voting intention, because it put Labour ahead of the Conservatives for the first time. Matthew Goodwin mentioned their Reform UK on 5%. He was saying 10%, and that was of Conservative voters. We can talk to the Deputy Chair of the Reform UK Party, David Bull. It's the party that came out of the Brexit Party. Hello to you. You're trying to win over these voters, David. What do you think they want to hear?
Well, I think it's very clear that there is no opposition and no government. Clearly, what has happened, and if you look at this reshuffle, the depth of it shows just how in trouble the Conservative Party is. I think what's happened is that, and Oliver Dowden is right, I think the election is going to be in May 2023.
So what do you think voters want to hear from you?
Well, I know this. I stood in Sedgefield. We went from a standing start to 8.5%. Richard Tice got 25%. And we took votes from both Labour and Conservatives. And I think one of your panellists already said that votes are lent, and they lent them to the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party has consistently lied, or certainly has not upheld its election promises. I think what people want...
Well, hang on. When you say that, what have they lied about?
Well, for example, they said they wouldn't raise tax, which is exactly what they've done with national insurance. They said you wouldn't have to sell your home to pay for social care, which is still the problem.
Right.
They said there wouldn't be a trade border in the Irish Sea. What people want in the Red Wall is a party that is honest with them and that delivers. And they know we were formerly the Brexit Party. They know we deliver.
Yes.
And they know that we are serious.
We'll come to the delivery moment in a moment. But what about those lies?
Well, what the people in the Red Wall, when I speak to in Wingerworth or Claycross, places I represent, is they don't want words like that bandied around. They're polite and they're reasonable, and they want politicians who talk to them straight and don't do the kind of thing that David has just done.
And who are honest about their pledges.
On the policy points, yeah, we stood on a manifesto, and I want to implement as much of that manifesto as is possible. We have also had the most extraordinary time of our lives. We've also spent nearly £400 billion. We've also gone through the first pandemic in a century. And I think Red Wall voters, certainly the ones I speak to in North East Derbyshire and beyond, acknowledge that that creates difficulties and a recognition that we have to face the challenges that are in front of our country, not the ones that Reform UK want to pretend are in front.
Right. And David, do you want to respond to that, particularly
Let's look at the NHS. I'm a doctor by training. The fact is the NHS has been run hot for a very long time. We went from 300,000 beds down to 180,000. And we're just throwing money at the NHS is not the solution. And the clue of our party is in the title. We need radical reform. We've got 6 million people waiting for elective procedures currently. We will go up to 13 million people waiting. And all my consultant friends say we will never, ever catch up.
Right. What about Labour voters? Those who either voted Labour before 2019, they may go back to the Labour Party. There's no sign that there's evidence that they're going to go to you.
Well, I do think the fact is that what Labour did is that, remember, in these heartlands, these were Brexit-supporting heartlands. These are people who work hard and expect parties to deliver. They were traditionally Labour. They lent their votes to the Conservatives. I don't think they'd vote Labour now.
Why?
And I know just from being on the ground and campaigning that Reform UK is a very credible party for them.
Right. I don't know why. You haven't presented any evidence. I mean, the reality is you've never won a seat. Can you be anything more than just a pressure group, whether it is on Conservatives and Labour or on Brexit?
Well, I mean, it was extraordinary. Of course, people said Brexit would never happen. Of course, we made that happen. But we will reveal all our policies at our conference, which is on October the 3rd. Interestingly, of course, at the same time as the Conservative Party conference. And you're right. First past the post is incredibly difficult for a smaller party to win seats. But we're determined to do this. We're getting increased traction. And I think you're going to see some surprising results.
All right, David, thank you. Seb, is there really a place in the political market for Reform UK?
I think when you look at what happened to those seats that went Tory, they went Tory via UKIP. And I think that Nigel Farage played a big role in splitting Labour's coalition, first through the European elections, then through a general election. And if you look at Lee's seat, which he very kindly spent time with me in North East Derbyshire, and is a chapter in my book, that had a massive UKIP vote that Lee then managed to take over to the Conservative vote. And one of the reasons Boris Johnson has been so tough on the small boat issue, for example, is that he's aware if a new party opens on the right flank and splits the right-wing vote, then he's in trouble. The genius of the 2019 election was bringing the former UKIP voters and those disaffected Labour voters into the Tory column. So it's definitely a threat for the future.
Jerry, how do you see it?
Look, this is really fascinating for me because actually during the 2019 election, I was Westminster correspondent for the Yorkshire Post. So I spent my whole election campaign in these seats. 9 seats went from Labour to the Tories in the patch that I covered at the time. And all these messages are exactly what we were hearing on the doorstep, out with activists at the time. I think where the Tories might come into trouble in this next election, whatever year it's at, is actually showing what levelling up has meant for people on the street. And, you know, I think it's ill-defined. It's been used to cover a variety of sins, whether it's going to tackle racial injustice or disability injustice and all kinds of things. I think that will be one of the main challenges that we're going to see coming up to that election. But I don't think, you know, these voters, they're not kind of, you know, definitely going to stay with the Tories next election. It's going to be a fight for every vote.
I mean, Angela, listening to this whole discussion, I mean, are you worried about Reform UK, previously Brexit Party and UKIP before it?
What struck me, I think, listening to, I think it's Richard was speaking, that's how often he mentioned Brexit, because that's this from the past. And I think the next election is going to be about the future and what kind of country we're going to be in the future, the point that you've made as well. So I'm not particularly worried, but what I am worried about is that we as a Labour Party make sure we give the arguments, present the arguments and make our case. And I think the challenge is for the Labour Party. So I don't particularly worry about the Reform Party, other than in the system we have, small parties can chip away at votes in narrow situations. But I think he's talking about the past, and the next election is going to be very, very much about the future. What country are we going to be? What sort of society are we going to be post-pandemic, post-Brexit?
I'm going to get a very quick response, David, because we're almost at the end of the programme, to what you just heard there from Angela.
Well, I think it shows just how complacent the two main parties are. They're not providing opposition, they're not providing leadership, and that's where Reform UK comes in.
All right, David Bull, thank you very much. Jerry, you said you covered some of these areas at your time at the Yorkshire Post. I mean, what about the sort of cultural values? How important will they be for the Labour Party to look at, not just economic issues?
I think the cultural values are very important. I think that tie has been completely severed with Labour. There's a lot of work to do. I think the party is really aware of that, but I think that's probably a longer term project than the next, 20 months or up to 2024. I think a lot of trust has actually been broken that can maybe not be repaired in that short time. Of course, that doesn't mean that people won't vote for them the next election, but I think that real kind of trust and the kind of inclusivity that these communities felt with the Labour Party has really worn away, and I'm not really sure it can be rebuilt in the kind of society that we see now.
It's the same for political parties, in that the traditional loyalties aren't there. You have to earn the trust of voters about what you're going to do, prove that you can do it. and you have to have an offer that gives hope for the future.
Right, culturally as well as economically.
Absolutely.
That's it for today. Thank you to all of my guests. And don't forget, I'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 12:15 with Politics UK. Please join me then. From all of us here, bye-bye.